The grease on my knuckles felt like a second skin as I adjusted the manifold. Heavy footsteps thudded on the teak decking above my head. Suddenly a shadow blocked the sun. "Get off the yacht, cleaning lady." Cassandra laughed at me. Her perfume smelled like expensive desperation and stale gin. I stood up slowly and stepped onto the dock without a word. She untied the heavy mooring rope with a smirk. "Bye," she shouted. I pressed a single red button. The yacht went dead. "Actually," I said, "I am the owner. I just remote locked your yacht and your career." The silence that followed was heavier than the humid harbor air. Cassandra froze with the rope still trailing from her manicured hand. The massive engines usually hummed with the vibration of 6,000 horses, but now they were hollow iron. Investors on the aft deck began to murmur. They looked at their glowing phones, realizing the onboard Wi-Fi had vanished into the ether. Cassandra's face shifted from triumph to a pale, waxy mask of confusion. She reached for the gold-plated throttle, but the levers moved without resistance. The ship began to drift aimlessly into the channel. I crossed my arms and watched the gap between the pier and the hull widen. A digital siren began to wail from the mast, a sharp and rhythmic sound that signaled a security breach. It was a frequency I had programmed myself during the long nights in the shipyard. The shore power cables hissed as they fell into the dark water. High-profile venture capitalists were now stumbling toward the railings. They looked down at me in my stained coveralls. They were starting to recognize the face from the quarterly reports. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of ozone. Cassandra began to scream orders at the hired captain, but his console remained a sheet of black glass. He threw up his hands in a gesture of total defeat. The yacht was now broadside to the current, drifting dangerously toward a cluster of jagged concrete pylons. I pulled a sleek tablet from my side pocket and swiped a command. The external speakers boomed with a pre-recorded legal termination notice. It listed every single one of Cassandra's contract violations in a calm, synthetic voice. Her investors turned away from her, faces cold and stony. The press gathered at the edge of the marina, their long lenses clicking like insects. This was not the glamorous launch they had been promised. It was a public execution of a reputation. Cassandra lunged for the manual override hatch, but I had welded it shut 3 days ago. She looked back at the shore, her eyes finding mine through the distance. I didn't smile. I simply watched the data stream on my screen as it drained her bank accounts. The yacht's hull scraped against a plastic buoy with a sharp, sickening screech. 2 black sedans pulled onto the gravel lot behind me. Men in dark suits stepped out, carrying folders that contained the finality of her ruin. The harbor master's boat approached the drifting vessel with blue lights flashing. Cassandra collapsed into a white leather chair that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. She looked small against the vastness of my creation. I turned my back to the water and walked toward the waiting cars. Behind me, the digital siren stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy chains. The boat was officially under new management. I reached my office before the first news cycle broke. The room was a sanctuary of glass and cold silicon. Marcus Thorne was already waiting inside. His face looked like crumpled parchment under the harsh LED lights. "You actually did it," he whispered. He pointed at a monitor showing the yacht circling the harbor like a wounded animal. I didn't answer him. I sat at the mahogany desk and opened the terminal. The log showed the system was holding firm. Cassandra had managed to call Marcus from the deck. "She thinks she can sue for damages?" Marcus said. He paced the floor with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I ignored his nervous energy and focused on the code. The screen flickered with a sudden alert. Someone was attempting to hack the root directory from inside the yacht. It was a crude attempt but persistent. I traced the signal back to the bridge console. Cassandra was not giving up yet. The pressure in the room shifted when the main screen turned gold. That was my personal color for a high-priority breach. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at the data. "They are bypassing the firewall," he muttered. His voice was thick with a new fear. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. This was not Cassandra. She did not have the skills to find the back door. Someone else was on that boat. A professional was working the keys. I tapped a sequence to activate the internal bridge cameras. The image was grainy but clear enough to recognize the intruder. A man in a gray suit sat at the helm. He was using a portable deck that looked like military-grade hardware. It was Elias Vance, Cassandra's brother and a former naval engineer. He looked calm while the boat drifted. He wasn't trying to save the ship. He was trying to steal the neural link source code. Marcus gasped when Elias's face filled the screen. "We have to stop him," he cried. "If he gets that code, our company is worthless." I watched Elias's fingers move with a practiced, lethal rhythm. He was seconds away from the core encryption. I had to make a choice. I could shut down the entire network and lose my data. Or I could let him in and spring a different trap. My hand hovered over the kill switch. I decided to let him believe he was winning. I opened a dummy folder and filled it with corrupted scripts. Elias didn't hesitate. He began the transfer immediately. The progress bar climbed toward 50%. Marcus gripped the back of my chair until his knuckles turned white. "You are letting him take it," he hissed. I smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the look of a hunter. The transfer hit 100% and the screen went black. Elias cheered on the monitor, pumping his fist in the air. He thought he had the crown jewels of maritime tech. He didn't know the files were encrypted with a GPS trigger. As soon as he leaves the harbor, the data will self-destruct and alert the authorities. But then a new notification appeared on my phone. The yacht was no longer drifting. It was accelerating toward the bridge. The Aegis surged forward like a missile launched from the depths. Elias had bypassed my propulsion lockout by hot-wiring the emergency thruster arrays. The yacht was now a blind giant racing toward the low-hanging steel of the harbor bridge. Marcus let out a choked sound as he watched the telemetry. "If that boat hits the pylon, it is all over," he said. I didn't blink. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I needed to regain control before the impact. I fought for the steering column, but Elias had physically jammed the rudder actuators. He was using a steel pry bar to hold the gears in a fixed position. The yacht was locked in a deadly straight line. The digital interface showed the distance closing. 400 yards. 300. The bridge loomed like a guillotine on the horizon. I tried to vent the fuel lines, but the valves were unresponsive. Elias had cut the manual safety wires. A new window popped up on my secondary monitor. It was a live feed from the ship's engine room. Cassandra stood there with a flare gun in her shaking hand. She wasn't looking at the controls. She was staring directly into the camera lens. "Stop this now," she screamed. Her voice was distorted by the roar of the rushing water. I realized then that she wasn't just a thief. She was willing to burn everything to avoid prison. I adjusted the camera angle to see the floor behind her. A thick pool of diesel was spreading from a ruptured secondary tank. The flare gun was a ticking clock. If she fired, the Aegis would become a floating inferno underneath the city's main artery. Marcus gripped the edge of the desk until the wood groaned. "She is insane," he whispered. I took a deep breath. I had one remaining back door. It was a high-risk pulse. I accessed the yacht's fire suppression system. It was a specialized gas-based array designed to starve flames of oxygen. I could trigger it remotely, but it would also knock out anyone in the compartment. Cassandra was still screaming at the lens, her finger tightening on the trigger. I looked at the proximity sensor, 100 yards to the bridge pylon. I had to time the gas release perfectly. If I failed, the explosion would be seen for miles. I slammed the enter key. The engine room filled with a thick, white cloud of suppressant. Cassandra slumped to the deck before she could pull the trigger. The flare gun clattered harmlessly against the wet metal. I shifted my focus back to the rudder. With the engine room cleared of oxygen, the thrusters finally sputtered and died. The Aegis slowed, its bow missing the concrete bridge pylon by less than 3 feet. The silence returned to the office. Marcus sank into his chair, gasping for air. "We survived," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. I didn't join his relief. I was staring at the telemetry for the secondary bilge pump. It was running at maximum capacity, even though the engines were off. I realized Elias hadn't just jammed the rudder. He had opened the seacocks before he fled to the life raft. The Aegis wasn't going to crash. The Aegis was slowly but surely sinking. The bilge alarm wailed through my desktop speakers like a dying animal. The Aegis was taking on water at an impossible rate. Elias had opened the sea chests, turning my masterpiece into a sinking anchor. I had to seal those valves remotely or lose years of research to the salt. Marcus stared at the flood sensors in sheer disbelief. "The waterline is already hitting the lower battery banks," he shouted. I ignored the panic rising in his voice. I plunged into the yacht's hydraulic sub-directory to force the actuators shut. The system resisted my commands. Elias had physicalized the lockout by wedging a heavy toolkit into the manual override gears. My digital authority ended where his blunt force began. The pressure was mounting as the bow dipped lower into the dark harbor. I could feel the weight of the water through the telemetry. The ship was dying. I needed a new way inside the hardware. I pivoted to the internal ballast pumps to counter the list. By shifting the remaining fuel to the starboard tanks, I could tilt the ship. This would bring the compromised valves closer to the surface. The hull groaned as the center of gravity shifted. Marcus gripped my desk, his eyes wide. "You are going to capsize us," he warned. I didn't blink as the angle hit 12 degrees. The telemetry showed the intake valves finally clearing the waterline. The shift in weight caused something heavy to slide across the engine room floor. The camera feed showed Cassandra's unconscious body moving toward a high-voltage junction box. If the water touched her and the live wires simultaneously, she was dead. I had to balance the ship to save her, but doing so would sink the Aegis faster. It was a choice between my life's work and a woman who had tried to destroy me. I hesitated for 1 second. I chose to vent the ballast. The ship leveled out, pulling Cassandra away from the electrical hazard. The cost was immediate. Water surged back into the hull with renewed ferocity. The primary servers on the lower deck were now partially submerged. I watched the data streams flicker and die one by one. I was losing the neural link source code in real time. Marcus slumped into his chair. "It is over," he whispered. I refused to accept that. I initiated a desperate wireless handshake with the yacht's emergency black box. If I could dump the core data to a satellite before the short circuit, I might save the prototype. The transfer bar appeared on my screen, crawling at a snail's pace. 10%, 20. The harbor police boats were finally flanking the vessel. They were shouting into megaphones, but the yacht was a ghost. Then, the transfer suddenly stopped at 43%. The connection hadn't failed due to the water. A secondary signal was jamming the frequency from a very close range. I looked out the window of my office toward the pier. A black van was parked near the water's edge with a massive high-gain antenna on the roof. I realized then that Elias hadn't fled the scene at all. He was sitting right outside my building. He was waiting for me to finish the hard work for him. The black van looked like a hearse parked against the gray skyline. Elias sat behind the glass, his silhouette illuminated by the cold blue glow of a signal jammer. He was bleeding my bandwidth dry to steal the remaining data blocks. Marcus stood by the window, his chest heaving with a mix of fury and terror. "They are right there," he choked out. I grabbed my leather jacket. I had to kill that jammer before the Aegis sank. I sprinted toward the elevator, leaving Marcus alone with the dying telemetry. The air in the parking lot smelled of salt and burning rubber. I reached the van and pounded on the sliding door with my heavy flashlight. Elias didn't open it. He just smiled through the tinted window. I reached the van and pounded on the sliding door with my heavy flashlight. Elias didn't open it. He just smiled through the tinted window. He knew I couldn't call the police without exposing the secret illegalities of the Aegis AI. I took a deep breath and swung the heavy light at the glass. The window shattered into 1,000 tiny diamonds. I reached inside and grabbed the high-gain antenna, yanking it from its magnetic base. The humming noise of the jammer died instantly. Elias lunged at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, animal light. He tried to pull me into the van. We tumbled onto the hot asphalt, struggling for control of his tablet. My knuckles grazed the rough ground. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the countdown. I managed to pin his arm and swipe the tablet screen. The interference was gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket, confirming the satellite handshake was active again. The transfer bar on the Aegis black box jumped to 60%. Elias laughed through a bloody lip. "You are too late," he spat. "The boat is already under." I looked toward the harbor. The white hull of the Aegis was almost gone. Only the mast remained above the water. A sudden explosion of light from the harbor stopped our struggle. The Aegis didn't sink. Instead, a massive bank of emergency flotation bladders erupted from the sides of the vessel. The thick orange fabric inflated with a deafening roar of compressed air. I had forgotten about the automatic buoyancy failsafe I programmed into the hull's shock sensors. The ship was bobbing like a giant cork. Elias stared in shock. The data was still safe. I had won. I stood up and smoothed my jacket, looking down at him. "You never were a very good engineer, Elias," I said. I held out my hand for the tablet. He handed it over without a word, his spirit finally broken. I checked the final status of the transfer. 100%. The Aegis was secure. The neural link was back in my hands. I turned to walk away, but a loud crack echoed from the van. It wasn't a mechanical failure. I turned back and saw Elias slumped against the van's side door. A small red dot was dancing on the center of his chest. It was a sniper's laser. I looked up at the roof of my own office building. A third party had entered the game. The people Cassandra really worked for were tired of waiting for the data. They weren't here to steal the code anymore. They were here to erase everyone who had ever seen it. I dived behind the rear tire of the black van as the first bullet shattered the pavement. Elias scrambled beside me, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, gasping terror. "They are here for the cleanup," he choked out, clutching his shoulder. I didn't ask who they were. The red dot was still searching for a path through the glass. I pulled my phone out and accessed the building's exterior lighting grid. I needed to blind the shooter before the next precise shot found us. I swiped the master override and the parking lot flooded with 10,000 lumens of halogen light. The sudden glare bounced off the asphalt and the white van walls, creating a wall of white. Above us, I heard a muffled curse as the sniper lost his visual lock. I grabbed Elias by his jacket collar and shoved him toward the shadows of the concrete stairwell. "Move or die," I hissed. We sprinted across the open space, our shadows stretching long and distorted. We reached the heavy steel door of the service entrance just as another round sparked off the metal frame. I hammered the keypad with a frantic rhythm. The lock groaned and clicked open. We tumbled into the cold, concrete hallway of the basement. The silence here was thick and smelled of damp earth and old pipes. Elias slumped against the wall, his face the color of ash. "They won't stop at the lot," he whispered. I knew he was right. I led him through the maze of maintenance tunnels toward the primary server vault. My objective was simple. I had to physically destroy the local drive before they breached the building's interior. If they couldn't have the data, they would kill to ensure no one else did. My footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor. I could hear the distant hum of the ventilation fans. It was a rhythmic sound that felt like a ticking clock. We were running out of time. We reached the vault door and I pressed my palm against the biometric scanner. The light turned green and the heavy bolts retracted with a deep, mechanical thud. Inside, the servers hummed with a low, blue light. I grabbed a heavy magnetic degausser from the tool rack. One swipe would erase everything. Elias watched me with a hollow expression. "You are throwing away billions," he said. I didn't care about the money. I cared about staying alive in this game. I was halfway to the main rack when the overhead lights flickered and died. A backup red emergency light kicked in, casting long, bloody shadows across the hardware. A voice crackled over the intercom system, calm and chillingly professional. "Damien, give us the drive and the girl stays alive." I froze. The girl. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized they meant Cassandra. She was still on the Aegis. I had forgotten she was trapped in the gas-filled engine room. I looked at the monitor on the wall. The feed from the yacht showed two men in tactical gear standing over her. They were holding a tablet that was slaved to the ship's internal systems. They weren't just after the data on the servers. They were using the Aegis as a hostage. Elias let out a dry, jagged laugh. "They always have a backup plan," he muttered. I felt the weight of the degausser in my hand. Everything felt heavy. I stepped toward the microphone. "Let her go and I will upload the encryption key," I lied. My voice was steady, but my mind was racing through the ship's schematics. I needed a way to trigger the Aegis's fire suppression system one more time, but the tanks were empty. I looked at the liquid nitrogen cooling lines that ran beneath the server floor. They were connected to the same emergency vent system as the yacht via the maintenance umbilical. A plan formed. I signaled Elias to grab the manifold wrench. "We have to vent the nitrogen into the harbor line," I whispered. He looked at me like I was insane. "It will freeze the entire intake manifold," he said. "Exactly," I replied. "It would create a massive pressure surge that would blow the yacht's emergency valves from the inside out." It was a violent, desperate move. It would likely destroy the prototype forever. I didn't hesitate. I turned the valve with a grunt. The pipes began to frost instantly, turning a ghostly white in the red light. A high-pitched whistle filled the vault as the liquid nitrogen surged toward the harbor. On the monitor, the Aegis began to shudder. The tactical team looked around in confusion as the floor beneath them turned into a sheet of ice. The pressure was building. I looked at Elias and saw a new realization in his eyes. We weren't just losing the data. We were erasing the evidence. The scream of the freezing nitrogen in the pipes was a banshee's wail. I stared at the monitor as the Aegis became a cryogenic bomb. The tactical team on the deck scrambled for the railings as the floor turned into brittle glass. They didn't understand physics. They didn't realize that the thermal shock was liquefying the carbon fiber seals in the hull. Cassandra lay near the center of the engine room, her breath a faint plume of white frost. I had to time the final vent perfectly or she would shatter. The pressure gauge on the wall hit the red zone with a sharp, metallic ping. Elias gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my leather sleeve. "You are going to blow the bulkhead," he yelled over the roar. I ignored him and slammed my fist against the manual release lever. A massive plume of white gas erupted from the yacht's side in the harbor. The Aegis lurched violently, shedding its orange flotation bladders. The sudden decompression threw the two tactical operators into the dark, freezing water. I didn't wait to see them surface. I turned back to the server rack and slammed the degosser against the master drive. The blue lights flickered once and died, signaling the permanent erasure of the Aegis AI. It felt like $1 billion funeral in a basement. Marcus Thorne appeared in the vault doorway, his blazer torn and his eyes wild with a new terror. "Damien, they are inside the building," he panted. He was holding a heavy fire extinguisher as a pathetic, blunt weapon. I grabbed the tablet from the floor and checked the satellite feed. The black sedans had moved from the lot to the front entrance of the HQ. They weren't just cleaners, they were a corporate hit squad. I looked at Elias and Marcus. "We have to go through the sub-level tunnels," I said. "We can reach the marina docks from the old coal chutes." It was a dirty, cramped path, but it was the only one they wouldn't expect. The elevator cables suddenly hissed. The sound of the elevator descending meant our time was officially gone. I led the way into the cold chute, the air smelling of ancient dust and damp mold. We crawled in a tight line, the sound of our breathing echoing in the narrow space. I could feel the cold dampness of the harbor through the brick walls. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "We have the girl," it read. My blood turned into ice. I stopped and looked at the screen. The monitor in the vault had shown the men falling overboard. This text meant there was a second team on the water. I had been outplayed by a shadow. Marcus bumped into my boots in the dark. "Why are we stopping?" he whispered. I didn't answer him. I pushed forward with a renewed, desperate speed. We tumbled out of the chute into the salty air of the marina, hearts hammering against our ribs. The Aegis was bobbing nearby. The yacht was covered in a layer of white frost, looking like a ghost ship in the moonlight. I saw a small black inflatable boat tethered to the stern. Cassandra was there, slumped over the side of the rubber hull. A single man stood over her, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a tailored suit that cost more than the van. It was the CEO of our biggest rival, Sterling Maritime. He looked at me and smiled, holding a small remote detonator in his hand. "Damien, you always were too smart for your own good," he called out. His voice was smooth and carried easily over the water. He didn't want the data anymore. He wanted the prototype destroyed so his own inferior tech could dominate the market. He was going to sink the Aegis with Cassandra on it to send a message. I stepped toward the edge of the dock, hands open. "I can rebuild it for you," I lied. My heart was a drum in my chest. He laughed, a dry sound that lacked any real humor. "I don't want you to rebuild it," he said. "I want you to watch it burn." He started to depress the button on the remote. I reached for the key fob in my pocket. It was the original remote lock I had used on Cassandra earlier that day. I had one trick left. I prayed the nitrogen hadn't fried the receivers. I clicked the button and the Aegis's high-intensity docking lights flared into life. The sudden blinding glare hit the CEO directly in the eyes. He flinched, his thumb slipping off the detonator for a fraction of a second. I didn't waste the moment. I dived into the water, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. As I swam toward the inflatable, I heard the sound of a heavy engine. A harbor patrol boat was screaming toward us with its sirens wailing. The game had changed. The harbor water was an icy vise around my chest. I surged toward the rubber boat as the CEO recovered his footing. He thumbed the detonator, but the frost on the hull had jammed the signal receiver. I reached the side and hauled myself upward, grabbing the wet rubber with numb fingers. Cassandra groaned as she regained consciousness, her eyes blinking in the strobe of the patrol lights. I lunged for the remote in the man's hand. We tumbled together into the cold, churning wake. We fought beneath the surface in a silent tangle of limbs. I managed to rip the plastic detonator from his grip and shoved him away. Breaking the surface, I gasped for air and tossed the device into the dark depths. The harbor patrol pulled alongside the inflatable, their weapons drawn and focused on the suit in the water. Cassandra reached out, her hands shaking as she pulled me back onto the deck. "You saved me," she whispered. I didn't answer. I only watched the bubbles rise. The Aegis stood tall despite the frost and the sabotage. The harbor master's crane moved into position to secure the frozen hull. Marcus and Elias stood on the pier, their figures illuminated by the red and blue flashes of the law. They looked like ghosts haunting the scene of a crime that no longer existed. I climbed onto the dock, my clothes heavy with salt and failure. The billion-dollar dream was a block of ice. I looked at the crowd. My identity was no longer a secret. Reporters swarmed the edge of the police tape, their cameras capturing my wet, tired face. I walked past them without saying a word. I had realized that the lie I lived was far more dangerous than the truth I feared. Marcus handed me a dry towel, his expression unreadable. "What now?" he asked. I looked at the wreckage of the black van and the shattered glass of my office. "We rebuild," I said. I was finally ready to lead. The truth felt like a heavy armor. Cassandra was led away in handcuffs. But she didn't look at the cameras. She looked at me with a strange, hollow respect. I had broken her career, but I had also kept her breathing. The CEO of Sterling Maritime was dragged from the water, his expensive suit ruined and his power gone. The board members would have to answer for their silence in the morning. I felt the weight of the neural link drive in my pocket. It was the only copy left. I had lied about the degosser. I stood on the bow of the Aegis as the sun began to rise over the city. The ice was melting, dripping into the harbor like silver tears. The prototype was scarred, but the core was intact. I realized I didn't need a mask or a basement to be the architect. I was the owner, and the sea finally knew my name. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from a ghost. I was not alone.